highly trained nuclear technicians all over Japan that are basically freaking out. And it is sad to say that there are deformities and other aspects of nuclear destruction of the environment ongoing that are showing up and are basically undeniable, especially to those of us not having to deny it because we're not living quite that close to it.
This is the technical term for what's happening to our plants. It's called fasciation. And if you just Google fasciation images, you can see numerous examples of this. This is a black-eyed Susan. Here's the thickness of a stem. And this is a side image. This is a better image. They refer to this as cock's comb, like the thing that's on the top of a rooster's head. Here's a portion of the video that I made last weekend. These were mutated dandelions that I found on Belle Isle in the Detroit River. That's right on the border of Windsor, Ontario, and Detroit. You can see the thickness of the stems.
Now, there is a huge potential left for nuclear impact from this disaster, which is the Israeli mistake. It is the leading edge of that Israeli mistake language because the Israelis were involved in Fukushima at least 4 different levels. I won't go into the details. If you want to, you can just do a Google on Fukushima, the plus sign, and the quote Israeli or Stuxnet or any number of other terms linking them, and you'll find that there are different levels of connection. The Israeli mistake is ongoing, as was forecast in the language. There are potentially 9 waves of this. The Israelis may yet have, the Israeli government may yet have the citizenry of Israel sacrifice themselves in a bloody war with Iran. That is yet to unfold. But that was only a component of the Israeli mistake. A lot of the other language is coming out now. We're seeing yet more signs that the war component of the Israeli mistake will play out as we had forecast. So do not be surprised if the Israelis attack and all hell erupts with resulting in a very brief period, say 2-3 weeks maximally, of a neutered, eunuched American empire and a glazed over Palestinian area, and the relocation of the Palestine population to an area within the Russian sphere of influence. That was basically the encapsulated nut version of what's going to happen throughout the war component of the Israeli mistake. Now, we're living through the Israeli mistake as Fukushima continues its ongoing and relentless grind into its inexorable end, which is the consumption of all these thousands of, or over 1,000 fuel rods that will spew forth deadly radiation that will go around the planet in 9 waves and will kill 1.289 billion people directly and relatively quickly as these things go. That forecast language for the 1.289 billion people is a relatively rare occurrence within the work we do, because the linguistics have a tendency, because basically we throw out all numbers unless they show up in a textual fashion through the archetypes. I won't go into the details of how all that goes, but it all goes back to the idea of set theory. And things are either in sets or not, and whether they're in a set and other sets and conjunctions and so on brings us to the ability to interpret this over the course of time, which is at the core of our work. The idea that you have a hot data set, good data set over the past 12 years of this work has proven itself out. There are times when, particularly for whatever reason, our sampling happens to gather enough data of the appropriate kind that the references within that data set for the reports that are based on it, and we can usually base 2 report series off of any given set because we're dealing with the delta, the change that occurs over time within language. But in any case, some sets are just have a lot more detail and a lot more accuracy. The Israeli mistake data set has proven very, very good. It was part of a very large run series that were very accurate especially for the long-term data for that period of time. So you get a set where you find that the language of the Israeli mistake goes to the idea of nuclear radiation blowing around the planet, and we're all pissed at the Israelis and so on, and it all comes out that it's the Israelis' fault. And then as part of that, of course, there is the war with Iran. Now, we have the Israeli mistake as the larger archetype, and it is within that we find the war with Iran as a smaller subset. And so the interpretation, you'd have a tendency to think that one is a cause and the other the effect. And in that sense, I don't really go that way because they're merely part of the same larger archetypical set. And so they're clumped together. The process by which all this occurs filters out, as I said, numeric references because the internet is filled with them. So when we do get these references, I have a tendency to pay attention to them, especially since we had another occurrence where we had 300,000 people, forecast language of 300,000 people killed, and a nation kicked back to a previous age, basically kicked back to the Stone Age. And that turned out to be a forecast part of the Sumatran Banda Aceh earthquake and tsunami. So that data set was very accurate. The process by which those numbers arose was the same process by which the 1.289 billion people that are affected or killed by the Israeli mistake's nuclear component, the 9 ill winds that go around the planet. That subset was through the same process. It was also, as I say, part of a larger set of data that has proven very, very accurate in forecasting a number of longer-term events that are now appearing and had started appearing and manifested over the course of last year, 2010, last year, and into this year, because it was a 19-month range. This very good data set of long-term elements has proved very prescient in a number of areas, not only the Israeli mistake, but in many of the effects that are now hitting North America. Of course, we didn't realize it at the time, and I was running interpretations that you have to understand how it works. You get the idea within an archetype of a diaspora, a mass movement of people, an exodus and an evacuation. I really hate using biblical or Judaic terms because they're truly inappropriate, but we're talking migrations here. So we get a data set that said migration, 220 million people moving north. Again, one of those times of when you pay attention to numbers. And a lot of other elements within that suggested that it was more aimed towards North America than elsewhere. Coincident with that, and also conjuncting with that, relative to the Israeli data set, was the idea of 9 ill winds. And these 9 ill winds were relative to a radioactive volcano in terms of how we would perceive it around the planet. Fumes, radioactive fumes just going on and on and on and on and on up into the upper atmosphere, into the 6 and 7 and 800 millibar range, so they get carried into the jet stream 9 times around the planet, raining death across a very wide swath of the northern hemisphere. I'm not trying to scare anybody or anything. This is just how the data came out. You can see why I'm a depressed bastard frequently. This is not good stuff to read. Anyway, so we get this data set. It had some real effectiveness. We start seeing a lot of it playing out relative to the Israeli mistake, and then we see the Fukushima thing. It yet remains that Fukushima may be the single point of cause for this 9 ill winds. And the 9 ill winds would be a 9 locations of the winds around radioactive material around the northern hemisphere trapped by the jet stream. And it would rain down fallout that would, in a short period of time, according to the data set, kill 1.289 billion people. And there wouldn't be a whole lot you could do about it. It would be reasonably random, but there were other components to it that suggested that as a reaction to that, large parts of the population would attempt to shift itself from underneath, or we just had the data set that, as I said, diaspora, 220 million people moving north. And it seemed to hit North America. Now, we could have interpreted that to say, well, an invasion of locusts from Mexico drove, the vast portion of the populace in the United States into Canada, because we just can't stand all them locusts and we fled. Or we could have said it was a series of earthquakes along the eastern corridor that released the radiation in the aging nuke plants up and down the eastern corridor as a subset of the component of the 9 ill winds associated with radioactivity. You see, the problem is that we get one set of data that masks another, because we have radioactivity showing up in one data set and in other data sets reinforcing each other. It has a tendency to mask specific causes of radiation, so we couldn't necessarily rule one out. And thus we could have a secondary or third or fourth or whatever level of ill wind that would come from a New Madrid fault kind of thing, which would be within the data sets of these 9 ill winds going around the planet, if you interpret them, each ill wind being a source of radioactivity. It need not be interpreted that way for the net result to be the same, which would be the 220 million people fleeing north. And at this point, it is our monkey minds, in terms of the interpretation, that say, we're all fleeing north from the radiation. There are other potential reasons that we might flee north, none of them particularly good, but, they could be of lesser importance. For a long time, I actually thought that the fleeing north component was going to be driven north from the Gulf due to the horrific chemical disaster that's ongoing in the Gulf of Mexico. And so you see how monkey mind works. We have the archetype, we have the descriptors from a data set that's manifesting in other parts of our planet in reality in terms of the forecast, and so our monkey mind casts around looking for some kind of a cause and effect to put to a larger pattern that we think we see evolving at the moment. And it turns out that a number of those patterns are being seen at this moment. Now, monkey mind aside, the data sets that reflected the Israeli mistake are still operable. They're still gaining fulfillment in the linguistics. It is slow, it is tedious, it is torture by drips as opposed to waterboarding. It is ongoing and is still reaching fulfillment. We still have a big gap, which is the war component, but a lot of the other language is getting reaching to about 38-39% for fulfillment, which is pretty close to what we consider accurate or 100%. Within that data set, the Israeli mistake, within the long-term data that flew out of that 2004 through 2006 Alta report series that led to the Israeli mistake series, as well as the evacuation of large chunks of North America, the 220 million people moving north, we have data sets that are showing up relative to ongoing activities within other temporal markers, such as markets, the powers that be, the press entity, and other subsets. So, basically, this is a sort of a minor heads up. If you're in the North American area of influence, you may want to just have a small little traveling kit prepared. It just on the idea that you may end up having to move whether you like it or not. And that's also good advice for Ben and other people in Tokyo, because Japan is quite certainly not done with Fukushima. And the real problem